All right, so what are we going to cover? We're going to cover the war in the Central Pacific. That will be from Tarawa to Okinawa and the Philippines. So let's get started. All right, so 1943, I like to look at it as the year of gathering strength. As we talked about last week, there were tremendous sea battles and tremendous amount of fighting in 1942. What we'll see now is that both sides are relatively exhausted, and consequently there will not be a major carrier battle for the entire 1943 year plus going into June of 1944. There will be sea battles, but there will be no carrier battles. The main focus of the war is going to be in New Guinea with Douglas MacArthur and the Australians moving up the New Guinea coast to drive the Japanese further and further away from Australia. And also, Nimitz will have continued the operations in the Solomon Islands, moving closer and closer to Rabaul. Remember, the original goal of both these offensives was to eventually take the Japanese position at Rabaul, because that was their main base in the Solomon Islands. So consequently, that is what they were going to do. But what also happens is the Navy has, as I've talked numerous times, had War Plan Orange. And War Plan Orange was basically to march across the Central Pacific and get closer and closer to Japan, to blockade the Japanese, never to invade Japan, but indeed to encircle the Japanese islands so that they would be cut off from supply and forced to surrender. So what we're going to see here today is the fact that the Japanese plan to stop that was always to have these islands that would be unsinkable aircraft carriers. So the unsinkable aircraft carrier island, you'll see that that plan just doesn't work out for them for numerous reasons, but the most important one is the giant increase in United States naval power. We see here in this picture a group of aircraft carriers, and I'll explain each one shortly. But in 1940, well before the war, a gentleman by the name of Carl Vinson, who was a congressman from Georgia, and you may be familiar with him, Carl Vinson put this thing together, this plan for a two-ocean navy. In other words, we would have a navy large enough to defeat Japan in the Pacific. We would have a navy large enough to defeat the Germans in the Atlantic. And he passes this thing through on a vote of 316 to 0. Again, this is in 1940, well before the war, and they authorized $8.55 billion to build this fleet. And more interesting to me is they'd already realized, you always talk about battleships in this class, but they had already realized by this time that the battleship was coming to the end, that indeed naval air power was going to be the future of the naval power. And Carl Vinson says, the modern development of aircraft has demonstrated conclusively that the backbone of the Navy today is the aircraft carrier. Again, this is in 1940. So, by May of 44, this is starting to take fruition. And we've commissioned 10 Essex-class fleet carriers, 9 Independence-class light carriers, and numerous things called escort carriers, which are made out of primarily cargo ship hulls. And some of the bigger ones are actually made out of tanker hulls. So they're not designed actually from the ground up to be aircraft carriers, but they are still very, very useful things to have around. Well, what has the Japanese been able to do in this same time frame? They've been able to build one fleet carrier and have been able to convert, I believe, 6 other ships to aircraft carriers. So you can see we're vastly outbuilding them. And by the end of the war, we have built 151 aircraft carriers. Certainly, there's nobody on Earth that could have done that except the United States. We had the capacity to build that many ships. Well, let's talk about the ships real quick. So the first ship here is the closest one. That is the Saratoga. That is a pre-war design, as we've discussed. The second ship is the Enterprise, one of the 3 Yorktown-class carriers. That is the last survivor. But again, it was an excellent design, but also pre-war at 20,000 tons. The next ship is the new USS Hornet, an Essex-class carrier. Remember, the previous Hornet was destroyed off Guadalcanal. So this ship is 27,000 tons. It has a very large air group, 80-plus aircraft, and it's a very, very fast ship. So this is our newest design. So everything we learned in those two previous classes, particularly the Yorktown class, we have now incorporated those features into the new Essex-class carrier. And so that's the new Hornet. And then the little guy here is an interesting thing. These are what we call CVLs, or light carriers, and they're not to be confused with escort carriers. Light carriers are built on cruiser hulls, so they're fast. They're made out of cruisers that were going to originally be built as cruisers under the plan, but we decided we needed to have more carriers right away, and the fastest way to do that was to find something to convert. And we indeed make 9 of these. And they're very fast, and they also carry a relatively small air group. Generally, they carry 24 fighter aircraft and 9 TBF Avengers. So what they could do, though, is they could keep up with the fleet carriers. They were fast enough to be an integral part of that. And consequently, what they could do is they could add to the combat air patrol because they have so many fighters. They can add to the anti-submarine patrol because they each carry 9 TBF Avengers, which can also be used as anti-submarine aircraft. So these are very, very useful little ships. Well, we come up with something else, too, because we've learned that we need to be able to replenish our ships at sea. And the reason we know that is after World War I, we did studies. And the studies showed that for every 1,000 miles that you get further away from your base, you lose 10% of your capacity as a fighting unit. Well, the bottom line is, in the Pacific, it's a huge area, and fleets are going to be sailing very, very far away from their actual bases. The other thing that's critical, too, in the Pacific is we really only, before the war, have 2 bases. We have Pearl Harbor, and we have Manila. Well, of course, we've lost Manila. So we needed to do something to get more and more combat power and keep that combat power sustained. So what we do is we develop the fleet supply train so that naval vessels can stay at sea for extended periods of time. And we'll see the growth of this at Pearl Harbor in '41. Nimitz had 77 support vessels. By December of '42, he's got 358 support vessels. So now what they can do with the U.S. fleet is we can resupply at sea. We can give them fuel. We can give them ammunition. We can give them mail. We can give them anything, basically. You can get new personnel in. And those little escort carriers, the ones made out of merchant ship hulls, they can be used to resupply aircraft to the fleet carriers. So when the fleet carriers have losses, those losses can be replaced. So our fleet can stay at sea for very, very long periods of time. Well, as we saw with the Japanese with Kido Butai, the strike force, their 6 carriers at Pearl Harbor, they are only capable of raiding. They do not have the capability to sustain those ships at sea because, quite honestly, they have only a very limited supply of tankers. So indeed, they can supply fuel to their ships, but they cannot supply everything else that we can. So this is a huge advantage that we have later in the war. Well, we also come up with some very, very interesting anti-aircraft technology. And some of that stuff is taking and repackaging things that already exist and making them work better. And some things are completely brand new. So the first thing is we had radar, but the way we used radar wasn't particularly effective. First of all, we didn't have a thing called a combat information center. So we couldn't really vector our aircraft to the proper spots. So if the Japanese squadrons or planes are coming towards our fleet, the aircraft would be theoretically sent to intercept them before they got too close and shoot them down. Well, there was too many problems with it, and it wasn't properly coordinated. The other thing was that our radar at the time was only capable of telling you how far away something was. It wasn't capable of talking about altitude. So we consequently couldn't say, okay, you need to be at 10,000 feet, that's where they're coming in from, so maybe you should be at 15,000 feet to be above them. So we'd have to stack units at different heights. So again, it was much less effective. So the Combat Information Center causes a huge advantage in our ability to intercept Japanese aircraft. Well, we also cook up another little thing, and that's called the proximity fuse. And hopefully some of you were able to see the video I sent out on this, because I could go on for a long time on this thing. But I'm going to try to speed it up. So here is how anti-aircraft fire worked previous to this. So let's say planes are coming in at 10,000 feet and they're going 250 miles an hour. Again, we can only estimate that. We don't know that for sure. Now I've got a gun here, and I'm going to fire an anti-aircraft shell at that plane. But what I have to do is I have to say, guess what height it's at, I have to guess how fast it's going, and I have to shoot and set a timer so the shell intersects exactly at that point and blows up. Well, that's a lot of thinking and a lot of calculations that need to be done very, very quickly. So consequently, we fire thousands and thousands of anti-aircraft shells, and the vast majority of them do no good. What this thing does is this thing input, and it's an amazing piece of technology to me for the time, is they have put a tiny little radar in the fuse of a shell. And so when you fire this thing, it has an area that it senses aircraft, and when it senses an aircraft in that position, then it blows up. So it's a very, very simplified version kind of a smart shell. It doesn't guide itself to it, but it does know when it's close to something and will explode. So that takes all those calculations pretty much out of it. And to think that this thing could be fired out of a cannon, so it's got a G-force of about 20,000 Gs. It's spinning at about 5,000 revolutions per minute coming out of that barrel. And this thing, there's no microprocessors. There's not even transistors. This thing is made with tubes. So it's an incredible thing to have been able to build something like this. And just for a real brief piece, these things were so secret that we would not use them on land. They would only be used at sea or to defend the British Isles from raiding German aircraft and V-1 bombs particularly. They were so afraid that the Germans or the Japanese would get one of these shells, they did not use them except as anti-aircraft until the Battle of the Bulge in 1944, Christmas of 44. Well, the first time this thing actually shot down a plane is January 5th of 1943. In the Pacific, the USS Helena shoots down 2 Vals, those are dive bombers, and it's the first of many, many kills by this incredible invention. So if you haven't seen the videos, watch it. It's a lot more detailed than this. All right, I could have picked a ton of planes. And for those airplane aficionados of you out here, I have just picked this one plane in the essence of time. And this plane is the F-6F Hellcat. It is the successor to the Wildcat, which was our primary fighter at the beginning of the war. This will be our primary naval fighter throughout the war. It's powered by an incredible engine. Many people feel that the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine is the greatest engine of the war, and certainly that argument is legitimate. But the engine that powered this aircraft, the 2,000 horsepower Double Wasp, is an incredibly powerful engine. Remember, the Zero early on in the war only had 960 horsepower. This thing's got 2,000. The engine is incredibly reliable, and it's used not in just in the Hellcat, but it's also used in the Corsair, the very famous Corsair, and of course by the P-47 Thunderbolt. So it's a very, very versatile engine, and it's excellent. It's great survivability. Well, this little fighter is designed specifically to take on Zeros. And what they do is they create an aircraft that's incredibly docile, it's easy to fly, so consequently it's easy to land on a carrier. The aircraft also is much faster than a Zero. Certainly it's not as fast as a Corsair or a P-40 or P-38, but it's still much faster than a Zero. It's well armed, and it's very reliable and quite maneuverable as well. At higher altitudes, it can maneuver exactly with a Zero, and because of its tremendous horsepower advantage, it can outclimb a Zero. So these are huge advantages. So 305 pilots become aces flying this aircraft, and it's credited with 5,000 combat victories. So we now have an aircraft that's better than the Zero. Well, we've talked about the losses of the Japanese in the Solomons campaign. We're going to go into a little more detail today. This gentleman is Saburo Sakai. I did mention him in a previous class when I was talking about the Wildcat. He is the highest ranking Japanese ace to survive the war. And at the beginning of the war, the Japanese did have a huge advantage of having combat-trained pilots from flying in China, and they had excellent aircraft for the time. But again, they never really improve on those aircraft. They're still flying Zeros at the end of the war. They're still flying the Army Hayabusa at the end of the war. They never can they make some new aircraft, but they're never really put into a massive amount of productions to become useful. So they never catch up to us in that regard, but they have another problem, is they decided to make their pilots the best in the world, and they're going to have an extremely elite group of pilots. So Sakai is actually an enlisted sailor, and he's in the Navy for a couple years, and he's picked for this program to become a pilot. Now, there's 5,000 people that are picked to be pilots out of this program. They accept 75 people, and only 25 of those people actually graduate to become pilots. So they're incredibly selective about who they're picking to be pilots. And there are other ways for them to get pilots, but all these pilots are in these little tiny groups. They never, ever really start to expand their pilot training until 1942. Well, by 1942, it's kind of too late. So you can see how incredibly tight, and these people were really good pilots, I guarantee that. But again, it's just amazing how small these groups are. Well, fighting in the Solomons forced some other issues too. Remember, we've talked about the Solomons being miserable. So the Japanese, because they're flying at such long distance from Rabaul to Guadalcanal, for example, they are getting more and more wear on their planes. The pilots are getting more and more tired. If a pilot is shot down over Guadalcanal, he's not recovered, he's just lost. He's most likely killed. They also suffer from poor food. Almost all these pilots have malaria. And Japanese, unlike us, where we have pilots serve for a couple of months on Guadalcanal, maybe 10 weeks, and then move them back and replace them with new pilots, these people continue to fight on and on and on. So they become more and more sick, they become more and more tired, and consequently they become much less combat effective, and of course that puts you in jeopardy. So by 1943, most of Japan's best pilots are dead. There was a special, not a special group, but the group that Sakai was in was one of the top groups in the Japanese Navy. And they were led by Lieutenant Sasai. He had 27 victories. He is killed literally over Henderson Field and crashes onto Henderson Field and is killed. Sakai's good friend, his name was Ota. He had 34 kills. He dies fighting over Guadalcanal. Sakai is severely wounded in the head and loses vision in one eye. He is sent back to Japan as a survivor. And the only one of this group that survives is a pilot called Nishizawa, who many people think may be the top-scoring Japanese ace of World War II. So out of these guys, only one person actually comes out of this battle in healthy. And when we look at losses, so from April of 42 till April of 43, Japan loses 2,816 aircraft, Navy aircraft, and the majority in the Solomons. Well, when those planes go down, they're also losing all these trained pilots and all these air crew. So you can see that the Japanese are in big trouble when it comes to naval air power. All right, So we'll talk about the invasion of Tarawa. And you can see Tarawa is this circle right here. And the idea is, with War Plan Orange, I talk about that a lot, but War Plan Orange was to move across the Pacific taking bases to be coaling stations. Well, in World War II, we don't use coal anymore, but it's still a great idea to have tactical air power as you move along. So the same really applies, that it's just that the goals are, the reason why we're doing that is just different. So instead of coal, we're looking for air bases. Well, we're going to start with Tarawa, and then they're going to move to the Marshall Islands right here, then the Carolines, and continue to move on towards Japan. So they're going to capture, the island is called Baishio. It doesn't look like it's pronounced Baishio, but that's the way you pronounce it. And that is in the Tarawa Atoll. The American Invasion Force is the largest yet assembled for a single operation in the Pacific. We have 17 aircraft carriers, 6 CVs, fleet carriers, 5 of those CVLs, the Independence class, and 6 of those cargo ship aircraft carriers. We're going to have 12 battleships, 8 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers, 66 destroyers, and we're going to be able to transport an entire Marine division and most of an Army division at the same time. About 35,000 troops to take this one little island. Well, the Japanese make the decision that they're not able to fend this off because they know that they're still trying to rebuild their carrier force and they're not going to be capable of stopping this invasion. So the men that are on Tarawa are basically on their own. And we can see Tarawa Atoll here. It's a tiny little island, somewhat like Midway. Basically, the entire island is an airstrip. They put 2,636, I euphemistically refer to them as Japanese Marines. They are actually termed as a Special Naval Landing Force. And they're very good Japanese Navy troops. And they also have 2,200 construction workers, most of them Korean. And they put 4 8-inch guns on the island, 50 assorted artillery pieces, primarily anti-aircraft guns, 14 light tanks, and they've heavily fortified the island with bunkers. And these bunkers are made out of those ubiquitous coconut logs. Coconut logs are extremely effective at stopping artillery shells, lighter artillery shells, not large ones, but lighter because they're so fibrous. So they build these bunkers out of these logs and then cover them with sand. So they're very, very sturdy bunkers. Well, on the 20th of November 1943, we begin to bombard the island. But we only decide to bombard the island for 3 hours. Probably should have gone a little longer. And the Navy hasn't really perfected shore bombardment yet. Remember, this is one of our first attempts at major shore bombardment against a fortified position. And the battleships are standing way off, and this island is really flat. It's not like it's not like the Solomons with big volcanoes. It's very, very flat island. And the battleships actually frequently miss the island. So the shells go over the top of the island and land in the ocean beyond it. So this shelling is pretty much ineffective by our heavy weapons. And the U.S. Marines are going to land in 2 types of vehicles. One is the Amtrak. It's kind of like, we look at it today as an armored personnel carrier. And the Amtrak is able to float, and then it's got tracks so then it can go onto the land kind of like a tank. The other one is the famous Higgins boat, which most of you are, I'm sure, are familiar, was created in New Orleans. And you've seen this numerous times in pictures from perhaps D-Day. There's many Higgins boats in that invasion. So you've seen the pictures of that one probably more frequently. But the problem with it is the Higgins boat draws water. It isn't tracked. And Tarawa is surrounded by a reef. Well, we think that at high tide that there'll be 5 feet of water over that reef so that the Higgins boats won't have any problems getting in. Unfortunately, at this time of the year, there's a thing called a neap tide. So the tide is much less deep. And so consequently, the Higgins boats can't get over the coral reef. Only the Amtraks can. And so then the Marines either have to wait for an Amtrak or have to wade in. Well, the Japanese defenders, because of the poor bombardment, they still have numerous guns available, and they destroy 50% of the Amtraks in the first day. So now with all those Amtraks lost, the Marines that are stuck out on that coral reef are going to literally wade in 400 yards under enemy fire. Now, I'm sure many of you have walked in the ocean, and you probably know that in the ocean you can't really run, nor can you really hide. So consequently, they take a lot of losses that would never have taken place had they done better planning or have had more Amtraks. Another interesting thing with the Amtrak is when the Japanese know there's a neap tide and they see this invasion coming, they think this is going to be a joke because we won't get over the reef and they'll just slaughter us. And when those Amtraks begin to crawl over the reef, the Japanese realize that indeed they are in trouble. Well, by that night, the Japanese have only, or excuse me, the U.S. Marines only have a small beachhead on this island because of all these problems. And they're very much afraid that the Japanese will launch a counterattack because that's always the Japanese strategy. The Japanese have always just said to, what they're going to do is they're going to let us get on the beach. As soon as we get on the beach, they're going to launch an immediate counterattack and push us back into the ocean. And you can see that really clearly in this picture because you see here 2 destroyed Amtraks and a Japanese tank actually on the beach. What the Japanese neglected to take into account is that we would have numerous destroyers, not just the battleships, but the destroyers would provide covering fire. And so consequently, when the Japanese would try to make these attacks, they would be slaughtered by basically artillery fire from the ocean because the destroyers are much closer and they can see what's going on and they're not going to miss at that range. So consequently, the Japanese attack was totally annihilated. And the other problem is it's never coordinated because the Japanese had a big command bunker and the Japanese leadership was all in that command bunker, and they start having more and more casualties, and they make a decision that they're going to evacuate that bunker and use it for a hospital, and then they're going to transfer to a smaller bunker. Well, while their leadership group is making that transfer and out in the open, a 5-inch shell from a U.S. destroyer lands in the middle of them and kills almost their entire command force. So they lose, basically the term would be decapitated. So their leadership is gone. So they never managed to put together the counterattack that they might have been able to do if they had proper leadership. Well, again, they always plan to attack us at the beach, but they fail because of the massive fire support. It's a big problem, and it comes on numerous times. So 3 days this battle goes on, and the Japanese, of course, because of their cult of death, they refuse to surrender. And they fight virtually to the last man. Only 17 troops survive. 129 laborers are captured. And U.S. losses are 1,696 killed in action and 2,101 wounded. But 687 of those dead come from a Japanese torpedo attack on one of those little escort carriers. So consequently, what develops from that is while the Navy is capable of having giant forces around a small island like this, numerous carriers, battleships, etc., they decide to push the Marines more and more to get these attacks done as quickly as possible so Japanese submarines can't come in and interdict our ships. So even though we have the capability to totally dominate an area, they make the decision that the Marines need to fight as quickly as possible. And this becomes an issue later in the war, particularly after this battle, though, where the press begins to think that there's a problem with Marine tactics versus the tactics that MacArthur uses in New Guinea, where they theoretically take less casualties. That's not necessarily true, but that is how the press portrays it. But what this also proves to the Japanese is without naval power, without being able to dominate the ocean, these unsinkable aircraft carriers indeed are not defensible, because we can come in with enough carriers to destroy their aviation on these islands. We can maintain combat air patrol over the island. They can never bring in more aircraft to defend the islands. So their whole plan to keep us at bay in World War II in the Pacific is out the window because of our giant increase in naval power. The next thing I want to talk about is the very famous piece about island hopping. Well, we've decided that if you can isolate these units with naval power, there's really no reason to attack them. You don't need to have these bloody battles. And in what we do in, for example, in Rabaul, we always wanted to take Rabaul. We decide finally, you know what? We don't need to take Rabaul. We'll just leave it sit. And so there are 90,000 Japanese on Rabaul, which is actually more Japanese soldiers than are defending Okinawa later in the war. So Rabaul becomes a giant POW camp. And best of all, we don't have to supply it. We don't have to feed them. We don't have to do anything. They're just stuck. So consequently, we start to bypass islands. And two of the biggest are Rabaul, of course, that's the lower circle here, and Truk Atoll. So both Rabaul and Truk in the Carolines are bypassed, and these giant Japanese garrisons are left to, in quotes, wither on the vine. And interestingly enough, on Rabaul, they are so short of food that the troops have to begin to farm. So basically, you've got all these Japanese troops that are farming. And at Wake Island, you may remember from our first class or second class, can't remember, those Japanese, because the island is so tiny, they actually are starving to death by the end of the war. Well, spring of '44 comes along, and we've captured key positions in the Marshalls. We've captured key positions in the Carolines, not the positions that necessarily the Japanese thought we would attack, but positions behind them. So consequently, now those units are isolated as well, and once again, we don't have to attack these strong point islands and save ourselves a lot of casualties. But the next objective is going to be the Marianas Islands. Of course, we know we're going to bypass, but the point is that we need to advance closer to Japan, and we need to be able to isolate the Japanese home island. Again, that moving, always moving across the Central Pacific. They're going to use the 5th Fleet. Briefly, the 5th Fleet and the 3rd Fleet are the same fleet. The only reason there's a 5th Fleet is when Spruance is in command, Admiral Spruance, it becomes the 5th Fleet. And when Halsey's in command, it becomes the 3rd Fleet, but it's actually the same fleet. It's all the same ships. And again, we can do this because of replenishment at sea. Well, now we're going to land an entire amphibious corps, not just a division, but a corps that's 3 divisions. We're going to use 535 ships. We're going to have 71,000 troops in the initial attack just on Saipan, and the total force of this group to take Saipan, Tinian, and Guam is actually 100,000 men. It's a gigantic operation. And the invasion of Saipan has another key piece. It allows us to get bomber bases in range of Japan. So the new B-29 bomber will be in range of Japan, and we can begin to bombard, strategic bombardment of the home islands of Japan. The Marianas have been part of Japan since World War I. They have an indigenous population of 25,000 approximately. So for the first time in the war, Japanese civilians are in harm's way. And the Japanese Army, because they thought the other bases would hold out much longer, have never really bothered to fortify properly Saipan. So what they do now is they realize that they're crumbling, and consequently they have to send everything they can into there as quickly as possible, but our submarines begin to sink all those ships. So large numbers of their soldiers that they're sending to Saipan are actually rescued, but they land without guns and equipment. So consequently, they're in bad shape. And then the defenders of Saipan, because they haven't had time to really build up a lot of fortifications like they did at Tarawa, are indeed in problems. So there's 30,000 men on the island, but they're not in particularly good shape. So the invasion of Saipan takes place on the 13th and 15th of June. Our fleet arrives, 3 days of attacks. So basically, instead of 3 hours of attack, we now have 3 days of battleships and cruisers and destroyers shelling Saipan. And they blast the defenses. On the morning of the 15th, we have 300 Amtraks land 8,000 Marines by 9 a.m. So you can see how much better we have achieved capability in just those few months since Tarawa to this invasion. And the Japanese plan, of course, is to launch immediate but nighttime counterattack, because that's their best time to attack, because they can negate our firepower, they think. But our ships at sea fire illuminating shells, almost their entire supply of illuminating shells, and the Japanese counterattack is smashed. So after the first day of fighting, the Marines are firmly ashore. It's going to be a long, long fight, but 15,000 defenders that we think are there are actually 30,000 defenders, so that's why this fight will go on longer. Well, when we come back from break, we will talk about the Japanese response. So if you'd be so kind as to make this a short break, I would greatly appreciate it. Okay, so I've talked about the Japanese rebuilding their forces. And what they managed to do is they've taken control of 2 ocean liners and converted them to carriers. Now, these are large ships. They're 24,000-ton ships, but they've got a couple of problems. They've got power plants that are not designed for military use. So consequently, they're very slow. And they only carry, I believe, like 52 or 54 aircraft. So for a 24,000-ton ship to have that few planes, they're really not fleet carriers by any stretch of the imagination. They only make 1 fleet carrier, like I said, that's the Taiho, and it's a very well-built carrier. It's large, it carries a large complement of aircraft, and it also has an armored flight deck. It's the only Japanese carrier to have an armored flight deck. So the other carriers they have are, they have a total of 9. 3 are fleet carriers. The Shokaku and Zuyukaku, our good friends from Pearl Harbor, are still around. They have 6 of these conversions. 2 of them, of course, are the ocean liners, and 4 of them are made from other types of ships. 2 are made from mine layers that are about 10,000 tons each, I believe, and then 2 of them are made from seaplane tenders, and the seaplane tenders, I believe, are about 13,000 to 14,000 tons. So none of these carriers are really equivalent to a fleet carrier, but they do manage to have 9 total for this battle. Of course, they're having difficulty replacing trained air crews. They've lost so many of their key pilots that that is a problem, and they can't train enough pilots fast enough. They also have another problem, is they're running out of fuel. So consequently, they can't do carrier practice because they don't want to use the carriers at sea to train pilots because they don't have a lot of fuel, and they also don't have a lot of aviation fuel. So this all limits the amount of time that they can provide training to their people. Well, and they also know that the U.S. fleet is getting bigger every day. I mean, they know this from before they started the war, that this was always going to be a problem. The war needed to be short. And what they wanted to do was to achieve a thing called Kantai-Kessen. And Kantai-Kessen has always been the thought process of the Japanese since the Battle of Tsushima in 1905 against the Russians, that there would be one major strategic battle that would decide the war, and of course they would win that battle. And the way they were going to do that is as we marched across the Pacific to get closer and closer to the home islands, of course their submarines and their aircraft would pick off our battleships, and eventually their fleet would be the same size as ours. Their fleet would be better trained and have more motivation, and consequently they would win. Unfortunately, it doesn't quite work out that way. So, they are going to have a plan to have this major attack on our fleet. And they think we're going to invade the Caroline Islands, particularly around Truk. Well, we don't do that. We invade Saipan, and that throws a major monkey wrench into their thinking, but they still launch this plan called AGO. And probably it's actually pronounced AGO. I'm probably wrong. But anyway, the plan for decisive battle. So Kantai-Kessen. They know that we've got a superior force. We have 15 carriers available, 900 aircraft. And what they're going to do is they're going to use an interesting tactic. They have a couple of advantages. First of all, their planes have longer range than ours. The second advantage they have is that there's trade winds in this area. So the trade winds are going to be blowing from east to west. So as they come toward us from the east, their carriers will be into the wind. Our carriers, on the other hand, in order to launch strikes, will have to turn around and actually sail away from the Japanese. So they have the ability at any time to disengage. If they need to run away, they can run away very easily because we can't really pursue them because we constantly have to keep turning around and sailing in the wrong direction. The other advantage they have is they're going to use that long range of their aircraft to have shuttle flights. So the plan is to launch their planes from further away than we can reach them, bomb our carriers, and then land particularly on Guam. So it's a really good idea. Unfortunately, it doesn't work out quite well. And again, what they're going to do too, once they land on Guam, they're going to refuel and rearm and bomb us on their way back to their carriers. So good plan, but there's a few problems with it. Because, first of all, we see them coming. U.S. submarines are tracking the Japanese fleet. And Admiral Spruance, remember it's the 5th fleet right now, not the 3rd, recalls his fast carrier group under Mitcher, and he tells Mitcher, you've got to defend the invasion fleet. And Mitcher doesn't want to do this. Mitcher wants to go after the Japanese carriers. But Spruance tells him, no, you have to stay because he's under orders from Nimitz to protect that invasion fleet. This becomes a huge scandal after the war, by the way. So on the morning of the 19th, the Japanese launched this all-out assault. But what they don't realize is we have new Hellcat fighters. We have combat information centers to direct those fighters to the proper place. And we have the proximity AAA anti-aircraft artillery fuse. And we massacre the Japanese group. They lose on the first day 346 aircraft. We lose 23. And it's forever gone down not necessarily as the Battle of the Philippine Sea, but as the Marianas Turkey Shoot. And you can see the pilot here. He's holding up 6 fingers. He shot down 6 Japanese dive bombers on one mission. What did the Japanese accomplish for losing 346 aircraft? They land 1 bomb on the battleship South Dakota, and they near miss several U.S. aircraft carriers. No aircraft carriers hit directly. Some have received light damage from near misses. That is all they achieved for those losses. Well, I told you those Japanese carriers are being stalked by our submarines, and indeed they are. The USS Albacore launches a visual attack. In other words, he's got his periscope up, and he's going to fire at the brand new Taiho. He manages to hit the Taiho with only 1 torpedo, but that torpedo hits a very key spot. Remember I told you Japanese carriers have their aviation fuel tanks incorporated into the hull. That transmits shock, and 2 of those fuel tanks rupture. Because the ship is so new, the damage control people on the ship are not very good, and they make a decision that in order to vent these fumes, they're going to turn on all their blowers. Well, what they managed to do is they managed to fill the entire aircraft carrier with aviation fuel fumes. There's a generator spark, and the carrier blows up. So the Taiho lasted 1 mission with 1 attack, only hit by 1 torpedo, and it's destroyed. Well, the USS Kavala fires 6 torpedoes at the Shokaku, our good friend from Pearl Harbor. They get 3 hits, and again, a fuel tank ruptures. Of course, with 3 hits, there's a lot more damage, and the Shokaku blows up and sinks. Now, Admiral Ozawa, who's in charge of this group of carriers, is on the Taiho, and he doesn't know what's going on because he's transferred to a destroyer. It doesn't have proper communication, so he can keep up with what's going on with his fleet. And he thinks that most of his planes are intact and are still on Guam. He doesn't realize that 346 of his aircraft have been shot down. So he makes the decision not to leave the area. He's going to stay in there and continue the fight. What he should have done, obviously, is run like hell. Total? I think he had about 650 before the losses. So that's on Guam, and that's on his carriers. So there's planes in both areas, okay? I think it was about 650. And then on the 20th, so this is the next day, the Mitchers decided to go after the carriers. He feels confident enough that he's protected the transports, and he's making a move to go sink Japanese carriers. And they don't discover the Japanese carriers until midday. Remember, the Japanese carriers are pretty far away, and they're steaming full speed to try to catch up with them. Well, they finally find them, and Mitcher makes a decision that he's going to launch a strike. But the strike is at extremely long range, and second of all, the planes will have to return at night, and they're not really qualified for night landings. But he makes this move anyway. Well, the planes do reach the Japanese fleet at dusk, and a TBF Avenger, that aircraft right there, which was also flown by George H.W. Bush, launches a torpedo strike which hits the Hayo, which is one of those converted aircraft carriers from an ocean liner. And again, fuel leaks, and the ship blows up. But the U.S. planes are extremely low on fuel because they've gone way beyond where they should have gone, and they begin to land in the water, and also it's nighttime. And so what Mitcher does, in a very brave move, he puts all the lights on his ships to try to get his aircraft back to their proper spot. And so we don't lose a lot of pilots and crew members, but we do lose 100 aircraft. So the battle ends. The Japanese have lost 3 carriers. Remember, 2 were destroyed by submarines. 1 is destroyed by our naval aviators. They lose over 550 aircraft. And after this disaster, Japan no longer has the capability to launch major strikes. Their naval aviation is gutted. They're really basically all they have left for naval aviation as a tactic that might survive against U.S. aircraft and U.S. proximity fuses is to do a thing called, commonly known in the United States as kamikaze, more properly spoken of in Japan as tokotai. Tokotai means special attack. Whoop. Yep. So, back to the invasion of Saipan. So the Army and the Marine forces, they continue to advance to keep pushing the Japanese to the northern tip of the island. The Japanese on July 6th decide to have a Gyokusai. We would refer to that as a banzai charge, but the proper term being Gyokusai means shattered jewel. So in other words, the jewel of their army unit will be destroyed intentionally. And the 3,000 soldiers launch this attack, including maybe 1,000 walking wounded that are unarmed. So the goal here really is just not to survive and try to take as many Americans as you possibly can with you. So the goal is 7 lives for the Emperor, so each man is to kill 7 U.S. soldiers. Of course, they don't do that, but they do hit a seam in the U.S. line, and this human wave attack actually does do significant amount of damage to an Army unit and actually overruns a Marine artillery unit. So the casualties are extremely heavy on both sides, but again, the Japanese intended to die. The Emperor also sends a message to the people of Saipan, the Japanese citizens, that if they will fight to the death, that they will be enshrined at Yasukuni. Yasukuni is kind of equivalent to our Arlington National Cemetery. It has more religious connotations than ours does, but indeed, they would be honored as war dead. And approximately 1,000 Japanese civilians commit suicide at a place called Marpy Point. Today it is referred to as Banzai Cliff. I think that name is inappropriate personally, because these people were terrorized and, if not forced to commit suicide, certainly they committed suicide for reasons that were unacceptable in my opinion. For example, they were told that the United States Marines would kill them all, rape them all, that United States Marines, in order to be a Marine, you had to kill your grandmother. And of course, in a society that is very respectful to elderly, that was a tremendous thing to tell people, that these people were murderers and killed their grandmother. I mean, it's just, they were propagandized into suicide. So I think there's a huge issue with their thinking there. Well, that leads us to the Battle of Peleliu. Again, we're moving closer and closer to Japan. This island is about 700 miles off the coast of the Philippines. The Japanese, though, have made a change. They've decided that trying to attack the Marines on the beach is not going to work in the face of our firepower. Also, they say that they do not want any more Gyokusai attacks. They do not want any more Shattered Jewel or Banzai charges. And the goal is to make the war as costly as possible to the United States. So what they're going to do is they're going to build multiple strong points. You can see the cave here in the cliff. There's another cave here that's probably, my assumption is that this was probably burned out by napalm, so that's why there's no more camouflage on that cave. But I don't know that for sure, but that'd be my suspicion. So they're going to build multiple interlocking fields of fire for their bunkers. So basically the way that works is, if you got bunker here and a bunker here and a bunker in the middle, if somebody attacks the middle bunker, you can shoot at them from two sides. And same idea is that they're mutually supporting. The other piece is that you really want to make sure that these things are as defended to the last man. They are not to leave there, they're to stay sheltered. And the idea for that is to negate our ability to use massive firepower, particularly air power and artillery. So consequently, they would be able to survive in these bunkers until they're rooted out literally one by one. And the idea of that is to make our casualties, they don't think they can win the war here, but they think they can make our casualties so bad that we will resort to negotiated peace. They first implement these on Biak Island and on Peleliu. They are perfected in the famous and deadly struggle for Iwo Jima. Well, the argument has been made, and particularly after, I'd say, the 90s, that Peleliu definitely should have been bypassed. And I certainly can't argue with that. Really, the invasion of Peleliu was probably a bad idea. We should have just left it alone and isolated it like we did Rabaul and Truk. It was expected to take 3 or 4 days, but instead the battle goes on for 2 months. The 1st Marine Division, the old breed famously, is incredibly badly depleted. There's 11,000 Japanese on this island, and they never do a banzai charge. They never try to attack us on the beach. They stay in these bunkers and get rooted out one by one. So, and of course, they refuse to surrender. So the Japanese achieved nearly 1-to-1 casualty ratio. They killed 2,236 U.S. soldiers, and 8,450 are wounded. Remember, there's 11,000 Japanese on the island. Only 19 Japanese soldiers are captured, and when we come to Iwo Jima, the numbers will be even worse. Well, Dwight had brought up a question to me via email, and he had asked the question was, well, why, if we were attacking the Japanese, and they were in these protected bunkers. Why were our casualties lower than the Japanese casualties? It would seem to stand to reason, kind of like trench warfare in World War I, where our casualties would be much higher on the attack. And there's two reasons for that. The first, and probably the most important, is we have the capability to fire all these shells. We have all these ships, we have all this artillery, and even the Japanese, when they're being shelled and shot at, do not stick their head up and start shooting at you. The natural thing to do by any human is to stay under cover. So if they're under cover, they're not going to be nearly as effective on defense as they would be out about shooting. The other reason we've talked about here is the Japanese tactics have changed. So the Japanese were taking all these terrible losses because they would try to beat us on the beach. They would try to launch banzai attacks and they'd get slaughtered by our firepower. They stop all that. When they do stop all that, all of a sudden our casualties and their casualties become one-to-one. So hopefully that answers your question. All right, well, the U.S. Army and Navy have a political battle going on. Amazing that Nimitz and MacArthur couldn't get along better. But the fact of the matter is the Navy wants to attack after they capture Saipan. They want to go and capture Taiwan, or Formosa at this time, and Okinawa. Well, MacArthur says, no. We should attack the Philippines. And either way, what they're going to do is they're going to cut the sea route from the southern resource area to Japan. So that Japan will not be able to get any resources any longer from the Netherlands East Indies. So all that fuel that they've been getting is going to be cut off completely. Well, Roosevelt shows up in Hawaii to settle the dispute. And MacArthur makes a great presentation saying that we need to liberate the Philippine people. They were our possession. They are our friends. And indeed, he wants to, in quotes, return, which was his promise. And he wins over Roosevelt to this strategy. So indeed, we are now going to invade the Philippines, which the Navy wished to bypass. And again, it's the same result. You're going to cut that supply route either way. But the problem is, and I'm of two minds of this. I really don't have an answer. Because by not invading the Philippines, the Philippine people are starving to death. And the casualties are very high because of starvation. By invading the Philippines, we have now turned the Philippines into a battlefield, which is never a good place for a population. And consequently, Manila becomes, in effect, a crime scene. When the Japanese refuse to evacuate Manila, they begin the systematic execution of the Philippine people inside Manila. And they kill approximately 100,000 Philippine civilians. And there's massive rapes and every possible inhumane thing they could possibly do. I don't have an answer for this. I can't tell you definitively if it would have been better to leave the Philippines alone and perhaps there'd be more starvation, or if the better thing to do was to invade the Philippines and then put them at risk because now they're in a war. So don't have an answer, but certainly you can make your own decisions. Well, the invasion is to take place on Mindanao. That is the southernmost major island. And Halsey, who now has control of the Third Fleet, sails by the Philippines and launches some attacks on Manila, etc., and notices that their air power is incredibly weak and makes the decision that says, you know what, maybe we should change our plans and not invade Mindanao, but go for the middle of the Philippines and attack Leyte. So in other words, to move up the timetable. And indeed, that's what Nimitz and the Navy decides to do. Well, the Japanese response to this is going to be the Battle of Leyte Gulf. And the Battle of Leyte Gulf is a last-ditch desperation move by the Japanese. Because if they lose the sea route to the southern resource area, to the Dutch East Indies, it doesn't much matter what's going to go on with their naval forces. And if you look at Admiral Toyota here, he's actually interviewed after the war by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. And I'll send you the link this week. And you can actually read his testimony to the Strategic Bombing Survey. But what he says is, should we lose in the Philippines operations, even though the fleet should be left, the shipping lane to the south would be completely cut off, so that the fleet, if it should come back to Japanese waters, could not obtain fuel supply. If it should remain in southern waters, it could not receive supplies of ammunition and arms. So there'd be no sense in saving the fleet at the expense of the loss of the Philippines. So the Japanese realize that there's no point in not using everything they have left to try to defeat this invasion. And it consists of 3 major parts, this plan, and it will, like I said, be the largest sea battle in modern history. And here we have the parts, but Japan is going to use its aircraft carriers in Section 3, and the idea for that is to lure Halsey's Third Fleet and its carriers north and away from the landing area at Leyte Gulf. Then what's going to happen is that's the northern force, is these carriers. They don't have hardly any planes, so they're basically just bait. He's going to have the strongest force, the center force, which will consist of numerous Japanese battleships and cruisers and destroyers. That's the strongest force, and their idea is they're going to get through the San Bernardino Strait and then come down and attack Leyte and attack the transports. Then there's a southern group that's going to come here and go through Surigao Strait, and they're going to attack Leyte. So once again, they're going to try to draw the carriers away and surround Leyte with battleships and cruisers. They're going to use their last 67 major warships and 300 planes. Most of those are land-based. And they're going to fight with that force 300 U.S. ships and about 1,500 planes. Consists of 4 major actions. There's 3 parts of the plan, but there's 4 actions. The first one being here at the Sibian Sea. And what that battle is the U.S. carriers see the central force coming in and launch a strike at it. And they destroy, for example, the battleship Musashi, which is the sister ship of the Yamato. And they damage a few other Japanese battleships. And the leader of that group, the Japanese leader, is a man called Kurita. And Kurita decides to move his force away. So he starts to retreat. You see this circle here. Well, the second part of the battle is the Surigao Strait, and that happens here. And those 2 Japanese battleships in a night action run into our old battleships from Pearl Harbor that have been rebuilt. And it becomes only the second battleship engagement in the Pacific War where battleships fight battleships, and the 2 Japanese battleships are annihilated. In fact, of the entire force, only 1 Japanese destroyer manages to escape. Well, what happens then is Halsey has seen Kurita, probably it's Kurita, retreating from the area. And he thinks, okay, he's safe to go after those carriers, because those carriers are basically not maintaining radio silence. They're doing everything they can to attract his attention. And so he sails off to the north. What he doesn't do, though, is leave a battleship force to guard the San Bernardino Straits. He doesn't also inform all the other U.S. ships in the area that he hasn't left a battleship force to guard that strait. They're unaware. They think that his fast battleships are still guarding that point of entry. Unfortunately, they are not. And so Kurita has broken through off the island of Samar scot-free. And now he's beginning to bear down on the U.S. little CVEs. Those are escort carriers made out of cargo ships. So 23 Japanese warships, 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and 11 destroyers are going to engage 6 of these little cargo ship carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. And this is perhaps one of the finest moments in U.S. naval history where this little force called Taffy 3 actually manages to fool Kurita and get him to withdraw. He thinks he's getting so much attacks from this little group that he thinks that he's run into the U.S. Third Fleet. So this little group basically fights off that giant Japanese naval presence. It's a total amazing battle to me. And again, I think one of the finest moments in U.S. Navy history. You can see from this picture, that's a little escort carrier, the Gambier Bay, and those are water spouts from a Japanese cruiser firing on it. The Gambier Bay, unfortunately, does not survive this battle. 2 U.S. destroyers are sunk, a destroyer escort is sunk, and of course the Gambier Bay is sunk. But the Japanese lose in this fight. 3 cruisers and 3 cruisers are damaged, and the transports off Leyte Gulf are saved. This is truly, if you want to research a great victory in American history, I would highly recommend you look at this one. Yes? Oh, okay, I'll make that quick. Is they still have planes. So they're launching all the planes, but the planes they have are not set up to attack ships particularly. They're to attack ground targets and to maintain combat air patrol. So the planes that go to the point of pretending they're going to have a torpedo run. So they're going to Japanese flak. Even though they don't have a torpedo, they pretend to have a torpedo just to get the Japanese to turn away from the Taffies. They literally drop depth charges on the Japanese ships. Now, depth charges are not a particularly effective weapon against a ship, but they did everything they possibly could to save this task force, and indeed, it's a great moment, really is. But the same day, that afternoon, something else happens. And the Japanese have made the decision to launch their first organized Tokotai, or kamikaze attacks. And 5 Zeros are armed with 550-pound bombs, and they are going to crash into U.S. ships. Well, this first group is led by the famous Japanese pilot Nishizawa. He is not there to be a kamikaze pilot. He is there to escort them in and to defend them from U.S. fighters. And unfortunately, Taffy 3, they become the target of the first kamikaze attack, organized kamikaze attack. So they fought off the Japanese fleet in the morning, and then they are now subject to kamikaze attack in the afternoon. The St. Lo is hit by one of the 5 aircraft, and it blows up. You can see that picture here. And 2 others of those U.S. little escort carriers are hit by kamikaze attacks and terribly damaged. So Taffy 3, again, suffers grave losses. So by the 26th, the next day, 55 kamikaze attacks have been taken place. The U.S. has no idea this is going on. This is brand new. So they don't react to it quite as well as they probably should have. And these U.S. Sangamon, Suwannee, and Santee, those are larger escort carriers made out of oil tankers. And then 3 other small ones are badly damaged, of course, and of course the St. Lo was sunk the day before. So 7 total carriers are either sunk or damaged by these first kamikaze attacks. And what the Japanese realize now is they know that they can't compete with our Combat Information Center and our Hellcats. They know they can't attack our fleet because the anti-aircraft fire is so good. But what they can do is use their pilots as human bombs. Again, the whole plan here is to make the war so terrible, the loss is so bad, that indeed we'll quit the battle. Well, that leads us to Okinawa. And again, the same idea takes place. We want to get tactical air power in range of the Japanese, and obviously Okinawa, being only 350 miles from the southern island of Japan called Kyushu, has now put the Japanese home islands in a position where they can be invaded. So the Japanese are very, very, very unhappy about this, and they're going to do everything they possibly can to find that victory, to find any way they can to get the United States to quit the war before we invade Japan or before we impose unconditional surrender on them. So the U.S. fleet shows up on April 1st of 45. 531,000 U.S. troops are on this fleet. Thousands of aircraft, hundreds of ships, and there's only 76,000 defenders of Okinawa that are actually military, so they conscript 20,000 Okinawan civilians, mostly young men. Remember, Okinawans are not considered to be Japanese. It's part of Japan, but they don't consider the Okinawan people really to be Japanese. So the Japanese government and the emperor believe that if they can gain a victory at Okinawa, that this will cause the end, that they can get that negotiated peace that they want to do. So how are they going to achieve this? What they're going to do is they're going to launch massive kamikaze raids to destroy the U.S. fleet. So they literally let the U.S. troops land on Okinawa unopposed, virtually unopposed. The Japanese troops, the 20,000 Okinawans and the 76,000 troops, are all dug into bunkers and caves. So they're well protected. And the goal is that they are going to use the kamikaze to destroy the U.S. fleet. That will isolate our troops that are on the island. Then their troops will emerge from their bunkers and launch a counterattack and destroy our forces. That is the plan. But the U.S. Navy defeats the kamikazes, thanks again to what they refer to as the big blue blanket. That's our fighter aircraft. And, of course, all the quality anti-aircraft capability that we have developed. But that is not without significant losses. 36 U.S. ships are sunk. 386 ships are damaged by kamikazes. And we lose 4,900 Navy men are killed in action off Okinawa. Of course, we destroy the Japanese garrison. We do take 7,000 prisoners, but primarily those are Okinawans. The Okinawan people, though, suffer terribly. There are 300,000 approximately Okinawan civilians on the island. Of that group of civilians, approximately 142,000 are killed in this battle. So the Okinawan people have, as a country, or as an island, as a nation really, lose almost half their population in this battle. And of course the Japanese have failed to deter the Allies, and the planning for the invasion of Japan will continue. Well, let's talk about Auburn's link to the war. After the war, because of a thing called the GI Bill, many Auburn students come from the military. Many of the people in the military that then retire will become professors here at Auburn. And perhaps the most famous is Corporal Eugene Sledge. He wrote a book. It's called With the Old Breed, because he served in the 1st Marine Division after Guadalcanal. He was at the invasion of Peleliu and Okinawa. If you'd like to see a TV version of this book, I could highly recommend a show that was put on as a mini-series, I believe 10 parts, and it's called The Pacific. And if you have Amazon Prime, you can watch The Pacific on Amazon Prime. And it is tremendously well done. It's by far the best thing I've ever seen done about the land war in the Pacific. So consequently, that is available. It's also written from another book by a man called Leckie, and his book is called Helmet for My Pillow. I would highly recommend watching this show, and of course I would recommend reading these books. After the war, though, Sledge becomes an undergraduate student here at Auburn. He goes on to become a biology professor, and he wrote the book so his family would understand what the war was like to him fighting the Japanese on these little islands. And when he comes to become a student here at Auburn, he's asked the question, what did you learn in the Marine Corps? Which is a standard kind of a question for, I guess, someone to ask an incoming student. And he says, because he's very bitter at the time, he says, to kill Japs and survive. That's what I learned. But he does cope with it eventually, and again, I would highly recommend his book. Well, many of you maybe know Evie Pouncey. And Evie actually is one of the founding members of what we know as OLLI today. It was called AU All. And Evie's father was Rear Admiral Albert T. Sprague. And during the war, he was a captain, but he was given an incredible amount of authority. Obviously, he was well thought of, because he was in charge of the entire naval side of the invasion of the island of Cebu in the Philippines. And then after the war, he taught, when he retired, he taught engineering here at Auburn. So certainly we have that connection there from Evie's father. And interestingly to me, my stepfather fought on Cebu as a captain in the Air Force. So consequently, I have a tie to her father as well. And one last thing in regard to Evie, not in relationship to this war, but her first husband won the Medal of Honor in Korea, unfortunately posthumously. So Evie had quite a history, a military history. So with that said, I'm going to give you a brief commercial. I'm going to tell you that I'm going to be teaching another class this winter. It will be a repeat of my atomic bomb class. For those of you that have taken it before, it's called the Atomic Bomb and the End of World War II. For those of you that have taken it before, there will be an entirely new week 2, and there will be an entirely new week 3, so you may wish to attend those couple of sessions if you have seen them class before. And in that class, we will discuss in much further detail, of course, the political sides of the war, the use of the atomic bomb, the kamikazes in much more detail, and of course the submarine warfare in much more detail, which I will not be able to cover in this class. So with that said, I got any time left? I got a couple minutes. So we have any questions today? Yes. Oh, we did. We had a strategy to combat them. They're just awful hard to stop. We had naval air power. We would station picket destroyers further out so that we would have more radar coverage. So the picket destroyers, so if you didn't hear it, how do we not have more strategy to combat kamikazes? The first thing we did, we would station little destroyers further away from the fleet so we would be able to detect the Japanese on radar much sooner. And of course then, because our combat information centers were so much better, we would launch massive amounts of fighter planes. And as the war goes on, we take more and more bombers off our carriers and put more and more fighter planes on our carriers. And that becomes a thing called the big blue blanket. So that's why. Also, the Japanese, in order to get to Okinawa, have to fly over 350 miles of ocean. They can't hide. They can't hide behind mountains or anything. They're out in the open. So they become easy to shoot down. Yes, sir? Yes. Well, that's because that's what was in range. Remember, Halsey, the question is why were most of the early kamikaze victims on small carriers? Well, the real reason of that is Halsey's big carriers, these planes were coming from the Philippine Islands. So Halsey's big carriers were up north chasing the Japanese carriers. So the carriers that were near the shore, were near the Philippine Islands, were all these escort carriers that were there to support the invasion fleet, and that's why. And I thank you all for coming, and we'll see you all next week for our last class.